She had kept this house for 30 years. She had scrubbed its floors in January cold and aired its rooms in August heat. She had kept the pantry stocked and the lamp wicks trimmed, and the front porch swept whether anyone was coming or not. She had sat with Edward Cole through 2 fevers and 1 winter so bad the creek froze solid for 6 weeks, and they had burned furniture to stay warm. She had until Friday to leave it. They buried Edward on a Tuesday morning in October, when the Wyoming sky was the particular gray that comes before the first hard frost. The preacher said what preachers say. The neighbors bowed their heads. Ruth stood at the back of the small crowd in her good black dress, the one she kept pressed and ready because Edward had always said a person should be prepared for the important moments, and she looked at the plain pine box going into the ground, and she thought about 30 years. 30 years of mornings, 30 years of suppers, 30 years of a man who said please and thank you, and who left wildflowers on the kitchen table sometimes for no reason at all, except that he had seen them on his way back from the barn and thought she might like them. She had not cried at the graveside. She would not cry now. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from today? Drop your state in the comments below. Stories like Ruth's were lived in every corner of this country, and I always love knowing where they're landing. And if stories like this one speak to your heart, you're always welcome to ride along with us here at the Cozy Hearth Stories. Now then, the daughters arrived that same evening.
Ruth heard the wagon before she saw it. She was at the kitchen stove heating soup, Edward's soup, the recipe he had liked since before she came to work for him. Thick with vegetables from the garden she'd tended every summer for 3 decades. She heard wheels on the gravel road and set down the ladle and wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. 3 women. She recognized them the way you recognize people you have seen twice in 30 years, by shape and posture rather than by face. Victoria first, the oldest, stepping down from the wagon with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent her life arriving at places and expecting them to be ready for her. Then Clara, younger, her eyes moving across the front of the house the way her mother's eyes used to move, taking inventory. The third one Ruth did not know at all. She went to the door and opened it before they could knock. Victoria looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked past her into the house. She said the house looked smaller than she remembered. She said they would need Ruth's room for one of them to sleep in. She said Ruth could have until Friday to make arrangements. Ruth looked at this woman who had visited her father's house twice in 30 years, who had not written, who would not come when he was sick, who had arrived on the day of his burial and walked into his house and looked past the woman who had kept it like it was a room that needed redecorating. She stepped aside to let him in, because that was what you did, because God-fearing women in Wyoming did not turn people away from the door no matter what those people had come to do. But she did not smile, and she did not offer toffee. And when Victoria walked past her into Edward's house, Ruth stood in the doorway one moment longer and looked out at the Wyoming evening and thought, she had until Friday. Edward had promised her more than that. Clara found her opinions about Ruth by breakfast the next morning. She shared them with Mrs. Alderman from next door over the fence while Ruth was washing the breakfast dishes 12 feet away through the open kitchen window. Clara had a carrying voice. She did not lower it. She said Ruth had always been just the housekeeper. She said her father had kept Ruth on out of habit the way old men keep old dogs, not because they are useful anymore, but because change is difficult at a certain age. She said it was actually very sad when you thought about it, a woman spending the best years of her life in someone else's house with nothing to show for it. Mrs. Alderman said something Ruth couldn't quite hear. Clara said yes, exactly, and that was precisely why they were doing Ruth a kindness by giving her until Friday rather than asking her to leave immediately. Ruth set the dish she was washing back into the basin. She picked up the next one. She washed it. She had learned a long time ago that you could not control what people said about you through open windows. You could only control what you did with your hands while they said it. So she washed the dishes, every one, thoroughly, the way Edward had always appreciated. He had noticed things like that, Edward had, the way a dish was dried, the way a floor was swept. He had never said so directly because he was not a man who made speeches, but he noticed, and Ruth had always known he noticed. That had been enough. That had always been enough. Victoria spent the morning going through Edward's papers at his desk in the front room. Ruth could hear the drawers opening and closing, the particular sound of a person looking for something they believe belongs to them. The third daughter, the one Ruth did not know, sat on the porch most of the morning and said very little. Her name was apparently Josephine. She was the youngest. She had her father's eyes, Ruth noticed, the same gray, the same quality of watching more than speaking. Ruth did not know what to make of her yet. By midday, the house felt different. Not dirty, not damaged, just different the way a room feels different when the wrong people are in it. Ruth had spent 30 years learning the particular rhythms of this house, which floorboard creaked in the hall, which windows stuck in damp weather, how long the stove took to heat in October versus March. She knew this house the way you know a piece of music you have played every day for decades, every note, every pause. These women did not know it at all, and they were already deciding what to do with it.
That afternoon, the attorney arrived. Grant was his name, a compact, careful man from town with clean boots and a leather case, and the expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer requires any particular preparation. He shook hands with Victoria. He nodded at Ruth the way men nod at furniture. He sat at Edward's table and opened his case. He said the estate was straightforward. The house and property passed equally to the 3 daughters as Edward Cole's legal heirs. He said Ruth's position as longtime employee of the household was noted and that her service was appreciated, but that it carried no legal claim on the property itself. Ruth stood at the kitchen doorway and listened. She said, "Edward promised me this house." Grant looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has heard this before. He said an oral promise carried no legal standing under Wyoming territorial law. Victoria looked at her hands. Clara looked out the window. Josephine looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the attorney. She said Edward was a man of his word. Grant said, "I'm sure he was, ma'am, but a man's word and a legal instrument are 2 different things, and without a legal instrument, I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." He closed his case. He said Friday was a reasonable deadline. He hoped the transition would be smooth. He left. The kitchen was very quiet after the door closed. The stove ticked. Outside, a horse moved in the yard. Somewhere up the road, a dog barked once and went silent. Ruth untied her apron. She folded it the way she always folded it, carefully, corners matched, the way her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old in a different house, in a different state, in a different life. She set it on the counter. She went upstairs, not to her room, to the attic stairs. She stood at the bottom of them for a long moment, looking up into the dark. Edward had told her about the Bible on their first Christmas together. He had said it was the one thing in the house that mattered more than everything else combined. He had said she would know when it was time to open it. She had never asked him what he meant. She was beginning to understand.
Thursday came in cold. The kind of cold that reminds you winter is not asking permission this year. Ruth built the kitchen fire before dawn the way she had built it every morning for 30 years. Paper first, then kindling, then 2 good logs set just so. And she stood at the stove and drank her coffee and watched the sun come up over the Wyoming hills and thought about what she knew. She knew Edward Cole. She had known him longer than his daughters had lived in this house, longer than his daughters had visited this house. She had known him through the death of his first wife and through the years after, when he had been a quiet man moving through quiet rooms, and through the slow return of something like contentment that had come to him in his later years. She had known him well enough to know that when Edward Cole made a promise, he made it with the full weight of who he was behind it. He had promised her this house. He had not broken promises, not once. Not in 30 years. She set her coffee cup down and went to work. By mid-morning, she had the bread baked and the floors swept and the front windows washed. The last time, she understood, that she would wash them as the woman of this house rather than as a visitor to it. She worked carefully, thoroughly, the way she had always worked, because the manner of a thing mattered as much as the thing itself. Edward had believed that. Ruth believed it too. Victoria found her in the garden just before noon. She came around the side of the house with her coat pulled tight against the October wind and her expression set in the pleasant, neutral way of a woman who has decided what she is going to say and is simply getting through the business of saying it. She said she hoped Ruth had made some progress on arrangements. She said the attorney had confirmed the transfer of the property would be finalized by end of week. She said there was a boarding house in town that took in women of Ruth's situation and that she had taken the liberty of inquiring about availability. Ruth straightened from the garden bed she was turning. She looked at Victoria. She said, "Thank you for the thought." She went back inside. Clara was waiting in the kitchen. This was less expected. Clara had spent most of the past 2 days finding reasons to be in whatever room Ruth was not in. Now she was standing in the center of the kitchen with her arms crossed and an expression Ruth recognized, the expression of someone who has been assigned an unpleasant task and is annoyed about having been assigned it. There were boxes on the kitchen floor, 3 of them, flat-packed and unfolded, but stacked in a way that made their purpose plain. Clara said Victoria thought it might be helpful. She said we can assist you if you need help deciding what to take. She said it the way people say things when they mean the opposite, when they mean they intend to supervise rather than assist, and that the deciding has already been done. Ruth looked at the boxes.
She looked at her kitchen, at the cast-iron pan she had seasoned every winter for 30 years until it was as smooth and black as riverstone. At the curtains she had sewn from cotton she had ordered from the catalog the second spring she was here, because the ones that were hanging had been worn thin, and Edward had not noticed, because Edward did not notice curtains. At the shelf of preserves she had put up in August 12 jars of apple butter, 8 of peach, 6 of the blackberry that Edward had loved best. She looked at all of it. Then she went to the pantry and took out one thing. Not the preserves, not the cast-iron pan, not the curtains she had sewn or the rag rug she had braided over 3 winters from scraps of worn-out clothing. She took the Bible. It had sat on the pantry shelf for as long as she could remember, too large for the regular bookshelf, too heavy to move easily, too present to ignore. Dark leather cover worn smooth at the corners, brass clasp tarnished to the color of old pennies. Edward Cole's name stamped on the front in letters that had faded but not disappeared. Ruth looked at the brass clasp. She put her thumb against it. She opened the Bible. Older than the house, older than Wyoming territory, the kind of old that lives in paper the way it lives in wood, in the smell of it, in the particular way it moves under your fingers, fragile and certain at the same time. Ruth turned to the front pages first. The family record, births and deaths written in different hands across different decades, the record of a family moving through time the way families do, losing people and gaining them and losing them again. She found Edward's name, his first wife's name beside it, the daughters listed below, Victoria, Clara, Josephine, with their birth dates in Edward's careful hand. She turned the pages slowly.
Psalms, Proverbs, the words her mother had read to her when she was a child in a house long gone in a state she had not seen in 40 years. She knew these words the way you know words that have been part of you since before you understood what words were. They steadied her the way they had always steadied her, the way good things do, not by changing what is happening, but by reminding you who you are while it happens. She reached the end of the Old Testament. She turned the page to the New and stopped. The pages were stuck together. Not stuck the way pages stick from age or moisture, stuck deliberately. She could see it clearly in the attic light, a thin line of dried paste along 3 edges of what appeared to be a folded section of pages, sealing them shut as carefully and intentionally as a letter sealed for mailing. Ruth sat very still. Outside, the wind moved against the attic window. The golden light was fading. Somewhere below, she could hear Victoria's voice, giving instructions to someone, the particular tone of a woman accustomed to giving instructions and being obeyed. Ruth looked at the sealed pages. She thought about Edward at his desk on winter evenings, the way he sat, always with his back straight, always with the lamp pulled close. She had brought him coffee at that desk more times than she could count. He had looked up every time and said thank you, every single time. In 30 years, he had never once not said thank you. She thought about the last months, how he had grown quieter, how he had sometimes looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she had not known how to read, something between sorrow and resolve, the face of a man working something out. She thought about what he had said about the Bible. You'll know when it's time. She pressed a thumbnail carefully along the sealed edge. The paste was dry and old. It gave without much resistance, the seal of a man who wanted the contents protected but not permanently hidden, protected until the right moment, until the right person. She unfolded the pages carefully. They were not Bible pages at all. They were documents, 2 of them, folded together and tucked between the testaments where no one would think to look and where they'd be safe from the damp and the mice and the casual curiosity of visitors. Ruth sat them smooth on her knees. The first was a single handwritten page in Edward's handwriting, a letter, her name at the top. She set it aside for a moment and looked at the second document.
It was official, printed on good paper with a territorial seal in the upper corner, formal language in careful columns. Her eyes went to the key words the way eyes go to the thing they are looking for before the mind is caught up. Deed of gift. Edward James Cole. Ruth Eleanor Harper. The property known as the Cole Homestead, in perpetuity, witnessed and notarized. There was a date, 3 months before Edward died. There was a judge's signature. There was the territorial seal pressed into the paper with enough force to leave a mark that would last longer than any of them. Ruth read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. She picked up the letter. Edward's handwriting, steady at the top where he had started it, and shakier toward the bottom where his strength had been by then, but still his, still recognizably his, the handwriting of a man she had known for 30 years. Ruth, I've done this properly and legally because I know my daughters and I know what will happen when I'm gone. I'm not angry at them for it. They are what they are, and some of that is my fault for being absent when they were young. But this house is yours. You have earned it 10 times over in ways that cannot be measured in dollars or in any ledger I know of. I told you once that you would know when it was time to open the Bible. I expect by the time you were reading this, you have already met Victoria. So you know. The document is legal. I had Judge Calloway record it at the territorial office in Laramie. Jed Morris next door was the witness. He will tell anyone who asks what he saw and when he saw it. Don't let them tell you that you don't belong here, Ruth. You are the reason this place is a home and not just a house. Edward. Ruth sat on the old trunk in the fading October light with the letter in her hands and the deed on her knees and the Bible open beside her, and she did not move for a long time. Below her, the house settled into its evening sounds, the stove, the floorboard in the hall, the particular creak of the third porch step that she had been meaning to fix for 2 years and that Edward had always said gave the place character. Her house, her stove, her floorboard, her porch step with its character. She folded the letter carefully and put it inside the deed and held both against her chest, the way she had held the Bible coming up the stairs, with both arms against her heart, the way you hold something you will not be putting down again. Then she stood up. She smoothed her dress. She picked up the Bible and the documents, and she went to the attic door, and she opened it, and she started down the stairs. Victoria was in the kitchen when Ruth came in. She was sitting at Edward's table, at Edward's chair, with a cup of tea and a ledger open in front of her, and the expression of a woman who is settled into a place and intends to stay settled. She looked up when Ruth came in. She looked at the Bible in Ruth's arms. She looked at the papers she set on the table. Her expression did not change right away. It changed slowly, the way expressions change when a person is very carefully deciding what their expression should be.
Victoria picked up the deed. She read it the way lawyers read things, not word for word, but scanning, her eyes moving down the page looking for the specific language that would tell her what she was dealing with. Ruth watched her read it. She watched the small muscles around Victoria's eyes tighten. She watched her jaws set. Victoria set the deed down. She picked up Edward's letter. She read that too. When she finished, she set it on top of the deed and put both hands flat on the table and looked at him for a moment. Then she looked up at Ruth. She said, "Where did you find this?" Ruth said, "In the Bible." Victoria looked at the Bible, then back at Ruth. She said, "This doesn't change anything." Ruth said, "I believe it changes quite a lot." Victoria stood up. She was taller than Ruth by several inches, and she used that height the way certain women use it, not aggressively, but with the quiet assurance of someone who has learned that physical presence is its own argument. She said she needed to speak with Mr. Grant. She said Ruth should not get her hopes up. She said documents of this kind were routinely challenged, and that a woman in Ruth's position would find it very difficult to pursue a legal claim without representation, and that legal representation cost money that Ruth likely did not have. Ruth looked at her. She said, "Mr. Cole was a careful man." She said, "I expect he thought of that too." She picked up the deed and the letter and carried him to her room and locked the door. She sat on her bed and read Edward's letter one more time in the last of the afternoon light. He had thought of everything: the judge, the territorial office, the witness next door. Jed Morris had been Edward's neighbor for 22 years, a solid, quiet man who kept his fences in good repair and his word in better repair still, and who had stood in front of a judge 3 months ago and watched Edward Cole sign his name to a document that gave his housekeeper his house. Ruth had not known. Edward had not told her. She thought about why. She thought about him at his desk in those last months, the quietness of him, the occasional look across the kitchen table that she had not understood. He had been carrying this. He had been making sure it was done right, and done quietly, and done in a way that could not be undone. He had not told her because telling her would have meant talking about dying, and Edward Cole had faced his dying the same way he had faced everything else, practically, without drama,
with his attention on what needed to be done rather than on how he felt about doing it. He had protected her, after 30 years of her protecting him. Ruth pressed the letter flat against her knee and looked at the wall and breathed.
She was not a woman given to large emotions in the presence of other people. She had learned that early and practiced it long enough that it had become simply who she was. But here, in this room, with the door locked and the afternoon growing dark outside the window, she allowed herself one long, shaken breath that was not quite crying and not quite not crying. And then she straightened her back and folded the letter and put it with the deed in the tin box she kept under the bed. She locked the box. She put the key in her apron pocket. Then she went back to the kitchen to start supper. Clara was there. She was standing at the counter, looking at the bread Ruth had baked that morning with the expression of someone who was hungry and annoyed about being hungry in someone else's house. She looked up when Ruth came in. She said, "Victoria's sending from Mr. Grant." Ruth said, "I expect she is." She went to the stove and built up the fire. She set the pot on. She began cutting vegetables with the particular efficiency of a woman who has made this meal 10,000 times and does not need to think about it. Clara watched her for a moment. She said, "You know this won't work." She said, "Documents like that get challenged all the time." She said, "You are one woman with no money and no lawyer, and we are 3 women with Mr. Grant and the full weight of territorial inheritance law on our side." Ruth kept cutting. She said, "Your father was a good man." Clara said, "My father was a sentimental old man who let you take advantage of his generosity." The knife stopped, just for a moment, just long enough that Clara noticed. Then it started again. Ruth said, "Your father was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and every year I knew him." She said it quietly, without looking up from the cutting board. The way you say things that are true and do not require any particular emphasis, because the truth of them is sufficient. Clara opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She left the kitchen. Ruth finished cutting the vegetables. She added them to the pot. She adjusted the flame. She wiped down the counter and hung her apron on its hook and went to the window and looked out at the Wyoming evening, the last of the light going gold on the hills, the first stars showing above the ridge. The yard she had swept and tended and known for 30 years, lying quiet in the dusk. Hers. Edward had said so. Judge Calloway had said so. The Territorial Land Office in Laramie had said so. Tomorrow, Mr. Grant would come with his leather case and his careful voice and his knowledge of Wyoming territorial law, and he would say whatever Victoria was paying him to say. Ruth went to the shelf and took down the Bible. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it down and opened it to the place where the pages had been sealed, and she smoothed her hand across the empty space where the deed had been. 30 years ago, she had come to this house with 1 trunk and $12 and a letter of reference from a minister in Kansas. She had not known Edward. She had not known Wyoming. She had not known what her life was going to be. She knew now. She had been home for 30 years. She intended to stay. Mr. Grant arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp. He came alone this time, no wagon, just a horse, which told Ruth something. A man who comes by wagon brings things. A man who comes on horseback comes to talk. And Grant was here to talk, to measure the situation, to assess what he was dealing with, to decide which way the ground was tilting before he committed his full weight to either side. Ruth let him in. She offered coffee. He accepted. She set it in front of him and sat across the table and waited. She had learned a long time ago that waiting was its own kind of power. People who could not wait always gave themselves away in the waiting, said too much, moved too fast, showed you exactly where their anxiety lived. Ruth had been waiting her whole life. She was very good at it. Grant wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He said he had reviewed the document Ruth had presented to Victoria the previous evening. He said it appeared on its face to be legitimate. He said the territorial seal was genuine, and that Judge Calloway was a known and respected member of the Laramie bench, and that the recording at the Territorial Land Office had been confirmed by his clerk that morning by telegraph. He paused. He said, However, Ruth waited. He said this document could be challenged on the grounds that Edward Cole had not been of sound mind in the months before his death. He said this was a common avenue in contested estate cases. He said a man in decline in health making a significant property transfer to a longtime employee was precisely the kind of situation that territorial courts looked at carefully. He said the word that would be used was undue influence. He said it gently, the way men say things they know are ugly when they want you to understand they personally find them ugly, while still being willing to use them. Ruth looked at him over her coffee cup. She said, Edward Cole was of entirely sound mind until the week before he died. She said, Dr. Hartley attended him regularly and will confirm that. She said, Judge Calloway spent an hour with him before witnessing that document and found him competent in every respect. She said, Jed Morris next door was present for the signing and will say the same. Grant looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, small and precise, the recalibration of a man who has come in expecting one kind of conversation and is finding another. He said, You have spoken with Mr. Morris. Ruth said, Jed Morris has been my neighbor for 22 years. We spoke yesterday evening. Grant drank his coffee. He said, Mrs. He stopped. He said, Miss Harper. He said it with a slight correction of a man reminding himself of a detail. He said, I want to be straightforward with you. Victoria Cole is my client, and I represent her interests, but I am also an officer of the court, and I am not in the business of pursuing claims I do not believe have merit. He set his cup down. He said, This document has merit. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then boots on the porch steps. The door opened, and Victoria came in from outside. She'd been in the yard, Ruth realized, waiting. And she looked at Grant, and then at Ruth, and then at Grant again. She said, Well, Grant said, The document is sound, Victoria. Victoria's face did not change. She had the particular stillness of a woman who has trained herself not to show what she feels in front of people she considers adversaries. Ruth recognized it. She had the same quality herself, earned through different years and different lessons. Victoria said, There are other avenues. Grant said, There are. They are not strong ones. Victoria looked at Ruth. She said, You manipulated a dying old man. Ruth said, I kept his house for 30 years. I sat with him when he was sick. I cooked his meals and washed his clothes and tended his garden. And I was there every morning when he woke up and every evening when he went to sleep. She said, Edward Cole was not manipulated. He was grateful. Those are different things. Victoria said, You took advantage of his sentimentality. Ruth said, He was not a sentimental man. You would know that if you had spent more time with him. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Victoria looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were her father's eyes, the same gray, the same directness, and for just a moment Ruth could see Edward in her face, and it made her chest ache in a way she had not expected. Then Victoria said, This is not over. Ruth said, I know. Victoria said, We will challenge this in court. We will tie this property up for months. You will spend everything you have on legal fees, and at the end of it, you may still lose. Ruth said, Perhaps. She stood up. She collected the coffee cups and carried them to the basin. She said, Or perhaps the territorial court will look at a legally recorded deed witnessed by a sitting judge and signed by a man of sound mind and decide that Edward Cole had the right to give his property to whoever he chose. She turned the cups over on the drying rack. She wiped her hands on her apron. she said. Your father worked this land for 40 years. He built this house. He planted that garden. He chose who kept it. She said, I will trust that choice. She looked at Victoria. She said one word, watch. Then she untied her apron and hung it on its hook and went out the back door into the October morning to tend her garden, because it was hers, and because the beans needed turning, regardless of what happened next.
Jed Morris was splitting wood when Ruth came through the fence gate. He looked up, set the axe down, waited the way Jed always waited, without impatience, without filling the silence with anything that didn't need to be there. He was 63 years old, Jed Morris, with the kind of face that Wyoming makes out of men who have spent 40 years looking at weather and deciding what to do about it. Steady, unhurried, the kind of man you wanted beside you when things went sideways. Ruth said, they're gonna fight it. Jed said, I expected they would. He picked up the axe and split another log, set the pieces aside, split another. He said, what do you need? Ruth said, I need you to talk to the sheriff. I need you to tell him what you saw when Edward and I went to Laramie in July. I need him to understand that this document is not something I found or fabricated or convinced a confused old man to sign. I need him to understand that Edward Cole knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. Jed set the axe down again. He said, I can do that. He said it the way he said everything, simply, without drama, as a plain statement of what was going to happen next. Ruth had known Jed Morris for 22 years, and in that time she had never heard him make a promise he did not keep. Edward had said once that Jed Morris was the most reliable man in Harlan County, and that in a territory full of unreliable men, that was worth more than most people understood. She said, thank you, Jed. He picked the axe back up. He said, Edward was a good man. He said it to the log he was about to split rather than to Ruth, the way men say things they mean deeply but cannot quite say directly. He said, he talked about you, not in a way that was anybody's business, just he talked about you the way a man talks about someone he trusts, like you were part of the place. Ruth said, I was. Jed split the log. He said, you still are. She went to Mrs. Alderman next. Mrs. Alderman was 71 years old and had lived next to the Cole property on the other side for 35 years and knew everything that had happened within a quarter mile in all that time with the comprehensive accuracy of a woman who pays attention and remembers what she pays attention to. She opened her door before Ruth knocked. She said, I heard the wagon last night. She said, come in. She made tea. She set out the good cups without being asked because Mrs. Alderman understood instinctively when good cups were called for. They sat at her kitchen table, and Ruth explained the situation clearly and completely, and Mrs. Alderman listened without interrupting, which was its own form of respect. When Ruth finished, Mrs. Alderman said, I knew about the Bible. Ruth looked at her. Mrs. Alderman said, not what was in it, but Edward told me he had taken care of things last spring. He came over for supper. He did that sometimes when he wanted company, and he said he had taken care of things and that Ruth would be all right. She said, I didn't ask him what he meant because Edward Cole didn't say things twice, and if he said he had taken care of things, then he had taken care of things. She refilled Ruth's tea without asking. She said, I will tell the sheriff everything I just told you. She said, and I will tell it to a judge if it comes to that. She said, I have been watching those girls ignore their father for 30 years while you kept his house and his garden and his dignity. And if they think they can come back here now and take what isn't theirs, they're going to find out that this county has a long memory. Ruth said, I don't want to cause trouble.
Mrs. Alderman looked at her over her teacup. She said, "Ruth Harper, you have spent 30 years not wanting to cause trouble." She said, "Edward caused this trouble by dying without telling his daughters what he'd done." She said, "The only question now is whether you're going to let his wishes stand or let 3 women who barely knew him decide what his wishes were." Ruth looked at her hands around the teacup. She said, "When you put it that way." Mrs. Alderman said, "I usually put things that way. It saves time."
The sheriff came to the Cole house that same afternoon. His name was Briggs, and he had been the sheriff of Harlan County for 11 years, and he was the kind of lawman who took his time about things, but took them seriously when he got to them. He read the deed. He read Edward's letter. He read the recording confirmation that Grant's clerk had sent by telegraph that morning. He sat at Ruth's kitchen table. Her kitchen table, she reminded herself. Her table, in her kitchen, in her house, and he looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at Victoria. He said, "Ma'am, this document is recorded at the Territorial Land Office in Laramie." He said it was witnessed by Judge Calloway, who is known to this court. He said, "I have spoken this afternoon with Jed Morris, who was present at the signing, and with Mrs. Alderman, who can speak to Mr. Cole's intentions, and with Dr. Hartley, who attended Mr. Cole in his final months, and who will confirm his competence." He said, "You are welcome to pursue a legal challenge through the territorial court. That is your right." He said, "But this property belongs to Miss Ruth Harper under a valid legal instrument, and I am not in a position to require her to vacate it." He said it plainly, without apology, the way men say things when they have looked at the facts and the facts have told them what to say. Victoria stood very still. Grant put his hand on her arm. She shook it off. She looked at Ruth across the kitchen. Ruth looked back. She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. The sheriff had said it. The deed had said it. Edward had said it 3 months ago in a judge's office in Laramie, with his name signed in the hand that had grown shaky but had not lost its intention. Victoria picked up her coat from the chair. She said, "This is not finished." The sheriff said, "That's your prerogative, ma'am." He stood up and put his hat on. He nodded at Ruth. He said, "Miss Harper?" He left. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at Josephine. Josephine looked at Ruth. And for the first time since the daughters had arrived at the Cole house on the evening of their father's burial, Josephine spoke directly to Ruth. She said it quietly, almost to herself, in a voice that had her father's particular quality of saying the true thing plainly. She said, "He always talked about you when we were children, when he wrote." She said, "He always said Ruth keeps the place right." She said, "I think I understand now what he meant." Ruth looked at her. She said, "Your father was a good man." Josephine said, "I know." She looked at her sisters. Victoria had already turned toward the door. Clara followed. Josephine picked up her bag. She paused at the kitchen doorway. She looked back at Ruth one last time. She said, "Take care of it." Ruth said, "I always have." They laughed before sunrise. Ruth heard them. She was already awake, had been awake since 4, lying in her bed, in her room, in her house, listening to the particular sounds of people preparing to leave. The soft thud of trunk lids, the careful footsteps of women trying not to make noise and making it anyway, the creak of the 3rd porch step that she had been meaning to fix for 2 years. She did not get up. She lay in the dark and listened to 'em go. The wagon pulled away just as the first gray light was beginning at the edges of the Wyoming sky. She heard the wheels on the gravel road, the same sound she had heard 3 days ago when they arrived. The same 2 horses, the same heavy load, but moving in the other direction now, moving away. She listened until she couldn't hear it any more. Then she got up. She built the kitchen fire the way she had built it every morning for 30 years. Paper first, then kindling, then 2 good logs set just so. She stood at the stove and waited for the water to boil and looked at the kitchen in the early morning light. Her kitchen, her stove, her curtains in the window, her Bible on the shelf where it had always been. She made coffee. She took it to the front porch. The Wyoming morning was cold and clear and absolutely still, the way October mornings are when the wind has gone somewhere else for a while. The hills to the east were just beginning to catch the first light, that particular pale gold that comes before the sun clears the ridge and that lasts only a few minutes before the full morning arrives. She had seen this light 10,000 times from this porch. She had never once taken it for granted. She drank her coffee. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel something larger than what she felt. Relief, perhaps, or vindication, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been told she does not belong somewhere and is proved otherwise. But what she felt was quieter than that. It felt like the end of something that had taken up a great deal of space and was now simply over, like a storm that has moved through and left the air clean behind it. She was glad the storm was done. She was tired in the way that comes after sustained effort, and underneath the tiredness was something else, something simple and solid and not requiring any particular name. She was home. She had always been home. That had not changed, could not have been changed, regardless of what Victoria had said, or Grant had implied, or Clara had packed into boxes on a Thursday morning. This had always been her home. Edward had simply made it official. The sun cleared the ridge. The light changed from pale gold to the full bright of a Wyoming October morning, and the hills went from shadow to color, and a hawk appeared above the tree line, riding the thermal in slow, easy circles. And somewhere down the road, a rooster made his opinion known about the arrival of the day. Ruth finished her coffee. She went inside. She washed her cup and set it on the drying rack. She tied on her apron. She went to the pantry and took stock of what needed doing. The bread that needed bacon, the preserves that needed labeling, the south garden bed that needed turning before the ground froze. She went to the shelf and took down the Bible. She carried it to the kitchen table. She opened it to the place between the Old Testament and the New, the place where the pages had been sealed for however long Edward had kept them sealed, where the deed and the letter had waited in the dark for the right moment to be found. The pages were empty now. The documents were in the tin box under her bed, where they would stay until she needed them, and she might need them still, if Victoria pursued the challenge she had promised, if this went to territorial court, if lawyers got involved and arguments were made and a judge had to decide. That might happen. Ruth was not afraid of it. Edward had been a careful man. He had thought 3 moves ahead the way careful men do. He had gone to Laramie when he still had the strength to make the trip. He had found a good judge. He had brought a reliable witness. He had sealed the documents in the one place his daughters would never think to look, and the one place Ruth would eventually look because he knew her well enough to know she would take the Bible and nothing else. He had known her for 30 years. She had known him. That was what 30 years was. Not a transaction, not an arrangement, not an employer and his employee moving carefully around each other in the same house for 3 decades. It was 30 years of mornings and suppers and winters and summers, and the slow accumulation of knowing someone well enough to trust him with the most important things. He had trusted her with the house. She had trusted him with her years. That was a fair exchange. That was more than a fair exchange.
Ruth smoothed her hand across the open pages of the Bible. The paper was warm from the morning light coming through the kitchen window. Outside, a horse moved in the yard. Her horse, the old bay Edward had let her use so long it had stopped being a question of permission and simply become a fact. She could hear Jed Morris working on his fence line next door, the measured sound of a hammer doing what hammers do. She closed the Bible. She put it back on the shelf where it had always been. She went to the window and looked out at the yard and the garden and the hills beyond and the wide Wyoming sky going blue above all of it. Then she turned back to her kitchen. There was bread to bake. There was a garden to tend. There was a porch step to fix. The third one, the one that creaked, the one Edward had always said gave the place character. She would fix it this week, not because the character wasn't appreciated, but because it was her step now, and she would decide what kind of character it had. She pulled the flour bin forward. She began to measure. The kitchen filled with the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular warmth of a house that has been kept well by someone who understood that keeping a house well was not servitude. It was love. It had always been love. Edward had known that. Now everyone else knew it too. Ruth Harper tied her apron strings and got to work. She was home. She had always been home. She intended to stay that way.